Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has been facing controversy, and people have speculated about how long he will be in the job. But Washington Examiner magazine contributor Tevi Troy wrote a piece for this issue looking at the fact that this has not been an uncommon thing for people in this role. Tevi, walk us through a little bit the history of recent defense secretaries and how some of them have fared when they've been in sort of streams of controversy.
Well, Jim, thank you for that, and thank you for the question. As you know, whenever something new happens in the world of the presidents, I try and look at presidential precedents, what's happened before in this instance. And so when I saw Pete Hegseth was in trouble, I wondered what had happened to previous defense secretaries. And when I started digging, I knew the parameters of the stories, but when I really looked into it, I realized, first of all, that the defense secretary is a relatively recent role. It only starts in the late 40s in the Truman administration. Before, you had a separate Secretary of the Navy and a Secretary of War, and then they merged that plus other stuff and put it into the Defense Department. But then I found that the first two Secretaries of Defense were both fired. First, it was James Forrestal and then Louis Oliver in quick succession. And Oliver, as I wrote in the piece, contributed to Forrestal's downfall. So it's a position with a lot of challenges. And I just talked about the guys who got fired. I mean, remember, there are people who didn't get confirmed, like Senator John Tower from Texas for his drinking issues. So it's a position that is fraught with a lot of challenges. There's a lot of expectations that you've got this big military and all you have to do is snap your fingers and the military does whatever you want. But the military does what it does. And, you know, as we know, most of these leaders have been civilians. You can't go straight from the military to Defense Department head without some kind of waiver from Congress, which is what General Mattis got. So it is a challenge to manage that Pentagon bureaucracy, and a lot of people, starting from the very first people to have that job, have run afoul of it.
You mentioned the Pentagon bureaucracy, and that is sort of one of the challenges of the job, is that you're potentially facing political opposition from outside the administration, people who don't support your party or support your president. But you also, if you're trying to do reforms and manage all of these people and maybe do things differently than they've been done in the past, you face a lot of internal opposition from the existing Pentagon bureaucracy.
Yeah, and it's a real problem. Look, we have 800,000 people working at the Pentagon. That's just the Pentagon. Now, there was a study that showed that the Chinese get 20 times as much defense procurement per dollar that we get. So we have to spend $20 for every dollar they spend to get the same amount of procurement. Why does that happen? Well, we have all kinds of rules and regulations and bureaucracies that have to manage the process, and our defense acquisition system is really, really not up to snuff. And that leads to a lot of costs. It leads to subpar technologies. It leads to things that break down and can't be fixed easily, and it leads to a lot of costs to the U.S. government. There's a reason that these jobs are often really fraught, and that many of the people who've had the job have not lasted that long.
Tevy, is there anybody who's served in the position in the past, somebody you focused on in this week's magazine, who maybe Secretary Hegseth could look to as an example for himself?
Well, he may not like this one, but Lloyd Austin was the Pentagon secretary who was the most on the hot seat that I found and still survived. Mm-hmm. And he survived because the president didn't want the disruption, didn't want to get rid of someone who he had some measure of faith in. Now, as you recall, the Lloyd Austin story is of a Pentagon secretary who's a little older, and he went AWOL. He was sick and he went to the hospital. He was getting a medical procedure. He was out of action for 3 days, and he didn't tell anyone. He didn't tell his own defense secretary. He didn't tell the White House. And in my humble opinion, and I wrote this publicly, it was a firing offense. But Biden was not much for firing, and he didn't want to do it. Now, there are reasons why Trump wouldn't want to fire Hegseth. Number one being that he doesn't want all those naysayers who didn't like the Hegseth appointment saying, "I told you so." So I think just like Biden's approach led to Lloyd Austin surviving, Trump's approach might lead to Hegseth surviving as well.
And you'd have to have a Senate confirmation for the replacement, and those confirmation hearings would likely be dominated by any Hegseth-related controversies from the past.
Well, not only that, yes, I totally agree with that, but also all kinds of questions about the signal chat and how they use classified information across the government, not just how Pete Hegseth used it. So it will raise uncomfortable questions that they don't want to deal with. Also, it's not so easy to get people confirmed. I mean, it was a really hard push. I think the hardest job they had to get someone confirmed who actually got confirmed. I'm not talking about Matt Gaetz, who didn't get, his nomination was pulled, but
Sure.
the guy who they had the most trouble getting confirmed was Hegseth. And to go back to square one and try and find someone new would be extremely difficult.
Thank you, Tevy.
Thank you.
If you're watching us on YouTube, click here to read this article in the digital edition of the Washington Examiner magazine.